Now, last week we discussed the Baal HaMaor, and it's been bothering my mind. What is the Baal HaMaor saying? Let's go over the Baal HaMaor for a second. We could do it outside, we could do it inside. Just to summarize and highlight the main points of the Baal HaMaor, the Baal HaMaor says, and this is the point that we're going to focus on now, and then in a few minutes, another point of the Baal HaMaor that's equally challenging. The Baal HaMaor claims that in the Gimel Averos Chamuros, that's Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Damim, you don't necessarily have to give it your life. It all depends what motivates the person who's forcing you. Is it lavurei al das, or is it lanos atzmo komachavin? And the Baal HaMaor claims that distinction was made by the Gemara here in Sanhedrin Ayin Daled Amud Beis with regard to Gilui Arayos.
I'm just going to interject that I sent the Makoros file both on the WhatsApp group and here on the chat, if anyone wants to see it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate all the work you do. And David also. So, as we say in Yiddish, stel sich vor, meaning imagine the following. According to the Baal HaMaor, in the Gimel Averos Chamuros, if the motivation of the person who's forcing you at pain of death in one of those three Averos Chamuros is motivated by Hanos Atzmo, just simply for his own pleasure, he has no interest in having you violate. Achashverosh doesn't even know she's Jewish. Then you're allowed to violate even the Gimel Averos Chamuros, but only if it's Lanos Atzmo Komachami. That heter and that permissibility does not apply if it's Lavurei al das Komachami. Now, this undermines everything that we have presented until this date with regard to Yeharg Val Yavar. Let me explain why I can't sleep at night with this Baal HaMaor on my mind, because everything we've said is the fact that through various Yalfusos, we derive the conclusions that in these three Averos, there's no V'chai Bohem. And the Torah, with regard to these Averos Chamuros, has suspended the halacha of Pikuach, the matir, shall we call it, the matir of Pikuach Nefesh. Once the Baal HaMaor introduces the distinction between Lavurei al das and Lanos Atzmo Komachavin, then everything breaks down. The entire structure crumbles in front of our face, because with regard to Averos Chamuros, what difference does it make? And if I could add, there's not one iota of a difference between Lavurei al das and Lanos Atzmo Komachavin. The Avera remains the same Avera Chamura. And the only understanding that would allow us to differentiate between the motivation of the person who's forcing you as either being Lavurei al das or Lanos Atzmo Komachavin is only within the context of Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem, such that we upgrade the Avera to the level of Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem because Lavurei al das Komachavin. So, for example, I can understand the distinction of the Baal HaMaor in the case of Shara Averos, where we said that the Machayev of Yeharg Val Yavar and Shara Averos is Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem, as the Torah says, Vikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. And if he puts your life on the line because he wants you to violate your religion, your Torah, that's Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem. The Torah says that if it's a public violation of the Torah in front of Toch Asar Yisrael, then you have to give up your life rather than be Mechal Hashem. And now you could add the distinction, well, why does he want you to violate this law? Is he motivated just for the sake of Hana? He has no interest in having you violate the Torah. As we said earlier, Achashverosh is not even aware of the fact that she is Jewish. Or is he motivated because he wants to undermine the Torah? And that's Chil Hashem, that's desecration of God and his Torah. So all that applies to Shara Veros. But we started our discussion, our analysis of Yehor Gal Yavar about a month ago, with the premise that with regard to Gimel Averos Chamuros, nowhere does the Gemara on Daf Ayin Daled quote the pasuk Nikdashti B'toch Bnei Yisrael. So, for example, in the case of Avodah Zarah, you have to give up your life because the Torah says, "V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol nafshecha, afilu notel nafshecha." And the Torah is basically, as we said a million times over, is suspending the principle of V'chai Bohem. And there is no V'chai Bohem, because this Avera trumps V'chai Bohem. It's on the top of the echelon. What difference does it make whether he's motivated for Hana or Lavuri al Das? It makes no difference whatsoever. It's the Achumras Avera that generates Yehar Gal Yavar. And we're not talking about Befarhesia, we're talking about Betzina. There's no element here of Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem involved. The question is one and only one: is there V'chai Bohem or is there not? How does the Baal HaMaor understand that in the case of Gimel Averos Chamuros, we can mitigate because it's Lanos Atzmo Komachavin and limit the halacha of Yehar Gal Yavar to a case of Lavuri al Das? We're not talking about something that's motivating Yehar Gal Yavar because of Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem. We're talking B'tzina, and we're talking about Averos Chamuros. And as a result of the Chumras Avera, the Torah says, B'chol nafshecha, and Yehar Gal Yavar. So I've been running around with this Baal HaMaor in my mind. I would even, again, I don't want to exaggerate, but I would even say I'm in a state of tirda. I'm torud ba. I can't figure out this Baal HaMaor. And by the way, I haven't even gotten to the Ramban's kasha from the Gemara Psachim Chaf Hey, which completely blows the Baal HaMaor out of the water, as we'll soon see. And we mentioned it last week, but tonight we'll try to develop it. If the Baal HaMaor in Averos Chamuros, by introducing Lavuri al Das Komachavin in the Yehar Gal Yavar of the three Averos Chamuros, is introducing the halacha of Kiddush Hashem, then forget about Averos Chamuros. The main factor here that generates the halacha, activates the halacha of Yehar Gal Yavar is Kiddush Hashem, which is limited to Lavuri al Das. But that can't be, for two reasons. Number one, because, as we said, the Gemara derives the three Averos Chamuros from Psukim, from Yalfuses, without any mention whatsoever of Kiddush Hashem. And number two, how could it be that this Kiddush Hashem B'tzina? We've never encountered such a thing.
Also, the Sfar of my Chazis doesn't work.
Excellent point.
No, but sorry, during Shas Shmad, is that not B'tzina?
That's a good question. Shas Hashmad might be B'tzina, but that's a halacha of Kiddush Hashem. Has nothing to do with the pasuk B'chol Nafshecha. Has nothing to do, as David points out, with my chazis and the hekesh of Gili Arayis to Ritzicha. We can't drop the ball here, Abosai. We've been dealing with Averos Chamuros. These are the three cardinal sins on the totem pole. They're on top. And now you're introducing Lanos Atzmo Komachavin. You're telling me that because he's interested in Hana, you can violate these three Averos that rise above V'chai Bohem. It seems, and this is where I lose my sleep, that the Baal HaMaor is operating with Pikuach Nefesh and V'chai Bohem, even in the case of the Gimel Averos Chamuros, to the extent to which he has to introduce another element into the equation. It can't be just Chumras Avera, it has to also be Kiddush Hashem. And the Baal HaMaor has given us an integration of what I call min b'she'eno mino. He's asking us to integrate two elements that are separated and different fundamentally one from the other. One is the Chumash Havera, number two, Kiddush Hashem, and he's operating with both of them. And if it was only Chumash Havera, then the Baal HaMaor might say, Yavor V'al Yohore. Like, for example, in the case of Lanos Atzmo Komachavin, where the Baal HaMaor is going to say there's no element of Kiddush Hashem, because the motivation here is purely L'Shem Hanoah. And if you're talking about the Avera Chamura, then Yavor V'al Yohore. And why? Because of Pikuach Nefesh. And the Baal HaMaor is introducing the operation of Pikuach Nefesh, even in the context of the three Averas Chamuros. That's a radical revolutionary change in our understanding of the Sugya, because we understood that all the Alfusas of Gimel Averas Chamuros would raise these Averos above V'chai Bohem and drop V'chai Bohem. And it matters not whether it's Lanos Atzmo Komachavin or it's Lavuri Al Das Komachavin. And now the Baal HaMaor making that distinction is introducing what I call Min B'She'eno Mino. He is integrating two elements into the equation. He's integrating the Chumash Havera together with Kiddush Hashem. And both together, and only when both can be checked off, when you have both together, it's also an Avera Chamura. And at the same time, it's Kiddush Hashem, then Yeharig Val Yavor. But if it's not an Avera Chamura, and it's B'tzina, then Yavor Val Yeharig. But even if it's an Avera Chamura, and even if the Torah says B'chol Nafshecha, you're allowed to violate the Iser Chamur if there's no element of Kiddush Hashem. A Pella V'Chiddush. Rabosai, do you see the radical nature of the Baal HaMaor introducing a whole nother condition to the halacha of Yeharig Val Yavor? It's not enough that it's an Avera Chamura. It's got to have an element of Kiddush Hashem.
We have to assume that it's only that it's Gila Rayas and Avodah Zarah, not Ritzicha.
Again, Rabosai.
Okay. Sorry for getting
I understand you're all very focused on my chazos, but I think it's gonna, at least for me personally, it's gonna be a little bit of a distraction if every minute we have to go back to my chazos. Let's just say this: in the case of Gilui Arayos, there's an Avera Chamura which rises above a Chaybohem. That's what we thought without the Baal HaMaor. And let's put Ritzicha into the same category. Even though, again, the derivation for Ritzicha was through his V'chai Bohem versus your V'chai Bohem Ha'chazis, but at the end of the day, the Avera of Shvichas Damim remains above V'chai Bohem. That's before the Baal HaMaor. There's no V'chai Bohem. Whatever reason, again, we'll go through the Maichazis and we can do this over and over again, but we're not going to make any progress whatsoever in the Baal HaMaor, which is the subject for tonight. So the first baby step, if you will, to understand the Baal HaMaor by introducing Kiddush Hashem is to open up the door for V'chai Bohem, according to the Baal HaMaor, where we had locked that door. We now have to open up the door. We have to allow and we have to invite V'chai Bohem into the picture, even with regard to the Gimel Averos Chamuros. Is that clear? Because otherwise, it's impossible to justify Yavor V'al Yehareg in Gimel Averos Chamuros in a case of Lahamnoah Kamachavim. Because again, and I'll emphasize this until it's coming out of your ears, the fact that it's Lanos Atzmo Kamachavim in no way mitigates the Avera. And the Chumash Avera remains even if it's Lanos Atzmo Kamachavim. And I'm not willing to, Ani lo muchan litpasher. I cannot back off on that premise, on that principle. The Avera again remains the same Chumash Avera, no matter whether this this Hamasnik is interested in lanos atzmo lavuri al das. It doesn't make any difference. And then the Baal HaMaor is saying, Yavar v'al yehareg in lanos atzmo kamachave, with regard to the three Averis Chamuros. The Baal HaMaor is therefore subjecting us to a new radical approach in which we have a Chai Bohem. But now we go on to point number 2, which is also very simple, that for Chai Bohem is not enough. Because in the Gimel Averis Chamuros, the man is willing to say that for the sake of saving my life, I am going to violate the most vicious, the most violent averos that HaKadosh Baruch Hu in His holy Torah could have imagined. All for the sake of saving my life. So what is it? What is the Baal HaMaor saying? I mean, after all, you're basically telling me that it's pikuach nefesh and for Chai Bohem. And then you're saying, no, this man, for the sake of a Chai Bohem, is willing to violate this most severe averos. And here's where the Baal HaMaor introduces Kiddush Hashem. And the Baal HaMaor insists that this Maisa Avera, which could be subject in and of itself to B'chai Bohem, despite its chumrah, becomes elevated to Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem if the nature of the act was done for the purpose of violating the Torah. In other words, what is the motivation here, so to speak? You're willing to violate the 3 averos that are so chamur for the sake of saving your life, and you're willing to apply v'chai b'hem. So the Torah says, hey, wait a minute. You know what? You could have applied v'chai b'hem. But at what point are you going to finally say that the Torah is more important than your life? That to violate the Torah, again, I emphasize those words, violate the Torah on the highest echelon, the highest level, the most severe averos, because when I use the term to violate the Torah, I have in mind lavuri al das. So that the act of saving your life now becomes a desecration of God's Torah. Why? Because we view this as a conflict between the Torah and your life. The Torah on the highest level of Averis Chamuros. And now you're saying, no, my Pikuach Nefesh is greater. So yes, there is Pikuach Nefesh. Otherwise, I have no way of justifying Lanos Atzmo Komachavik, which according to the Baal HaMaor is a mitigating factor and allows you to violate the Averis Chamuros. So I have no choice but to introduce Pikuach Nefesh and V'chai Bohem to the Gimel Averis Chamuros. But at what point do we say that when you're willing to violate the Gimel Averis Chamuros in order to save your own skin, it now becomes a desecration of the Torah? And the answer is it depends on the motivating factor. It depends on the nature and the complexion of the Avera. And the Baal HaMaor claims, and this is his revolution, that when you want to define the nature of the action and whether or not it constitutes a violation, a disgrace, a desecration of the Torah, and you want to define the complexion of the action, I want to categorize the action, says the Baal HaMaor, we're going to make this action into Chil Hashem. And if we do so, he's willing to save his life at the expense of Chil Hashem, says the Baal HaMaor, Yeharig Val Yav. So again, it's an integration of 2 factors, A plus B. Yes, we have Pikuach Nefesh in the background. But when we integrate A and B, and he's going to save his life and make a statement that I will desecrate the Torah, and in order to save my life, that becomes Chil Hashem, according to the Baal HaMaor. And even though the Avera Chamur itself could lend itself to the matir of Pikuach Nefesh, and V'chai Bohem, Horaya Lanos Atzmo Kamachavin is a mitigating circumstance, and you're allowed to violate the Averas Chamur according to Baal HaMaor. But despite that fact, the Baal HaMaor reveals a secret, that there's a limit to how far Pikuach Nefesh and V'chai Bohem could go. It's almost as if the pasuk of Lo Sechalu Shem Kodshi, V'nikdashti B'toch Bnei Yisrael, that pasuk will now shed a light on the Avera Chamura. It will change the nature of the Avera Chamura. And it will remove and undermine the V'chai Bohem that would have theoretically applied to the Avera Chamura. What undermines and negates the V'chai Bohem? It's the fact that you made a decision that you will desecrate the Torah through these Averos Chamuros in order to save your life. And you and I would have said, well, was is schlecht? What's catastrophic here? I mean, the Torah says V'chai Bohem. I'm allowed to save my life. Nay, I'm obligated to save my life. You remember the discussion that we had about putting your life into danger to save someone else's life. You might not even be allowed to do that. So Pikuach Nefesh is a great mitzvah. And on Shabbos, we'll call upon the Gadol B'Yisrael to violate the Shabbos for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh. Great, great mitzvah. But that mitzvah has something that puts the brakes on it, that limits it, that holds it back. And that is when the violation of the Torah on the most severe Avera reaches the level of Chil Hashem, of a statement that's defined as desecrating God's Torah for the sake of life, then the Torah says, Yehard Val Yavar. At what point, says the Baal HaMaor, does violating the most severe Averos for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh constitute and qualify and categorize it as Chil Hashem? At the point in which there's Lavuri al Das, that this is not only about your life, my friend. If it was only about your life and saving your life, we would apply the principle of V'chai Bohem, hence, Lanos Atzmo Komacham. But if it's not just about your life, my friend, but it's about violating the Torah, and on the highest echelon, the highest level, the most severe Averos, and you're going to say V'chai Bohem, says the Baal HaMaor, at this point, Lavuri al Das takes over, defines the mice and categorizes it as Chil Hashem. And therefore Yehorik Value. But only because of Lavuri al Das.
You'd have to reread a lot in the Gemara. So there's Ikar Chasam and Asef or whatever. You'd have to interpret a lot in the way the Gemara is written.
Well, let's read one line in the Gemara, and the Baal HaMaor bases himself on that one line. Let's turn to Daf Ayin Daled Omid Beis. And if you take a look at Rava Omar, do you see Rava Omar? It's about halfway down the Omar. The first word in the line is Rava. Rava Omar, Hanos Atzmo Shiny. Now, the Baal HaMaor assumes that Esther was married to Mordechai. That's not universally accepted. The Baal HaMaor therefore assumes that Esther is a problem of Gili Arayos, one of the big three, Averes Chamuros. Rava asks the question, how could Esther, the great Esther, the Tzaddikas, how could she be allowed to violate Gili Arayos? Not like Rabbeinu Tam, who holds Malach Avshverish, who was a god. Baal HaMaor never accepted that. Not like other Rishonim who say that Esther was not married to Mordechai. No, the Baal HaMaor says she was married to Mordechai. We have a full-fledged Gili Arayos here with a god, and she's married to a Jewish man. And Rava says, Hanas Atzmo Shiny. And he goes ahead and speaks about Avodah Zarah in a case of Hanas Atzmo. There were sellers who sold various, what's the word I'm looking for? Accessories for Avodah Zarah. And they did so just because they were motivated to make a buck. And we're going to allow it. And Yavar V'al Yehard. But again, I don't want to get into that yet because I just want to focus on, you asked me, where did the Baal HaMaor come off with this? The Baal HaMaor understood that Esther was Gila Arayas and that Rava found a mitigating factor in the fact that Achashverosh was only interested in Hanas Atzmo. He didn't even know she was Jewish. And the Baal HaMaor extrapolated from the words of Rava that in general, as far as Gimel Averes Chamur is concerned, and whether or not it's Yehorig Val Yav, you have to ask yourself one question. What motivates him? Now, let's go on to the more complicated part of the Baal HaMaor, if it's not complicated enough. Kumtois, according to Baal HaMaor, even B'tzina, there's a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and an Aveira of Chil Hashem. Because the Baal HaMaor is going to say in Lavuri al Das, because of Chil Hashem, Yehorig Val Yav. And it's even B'tzina. As far as B'far Hesi is concerned, that already applies to Shar Averis Chamuris. I think that we need another leap of faith over here. The pasuk says, "V'nikdashti b'tov b'nei Yisrael," clearly indicating that Yehorig Val Yavar and Kiddush Hashem apply Bifar Hesi. So if a guy forces me to eat Chas v'shalom nevela in private, there are only 9 Jews there, but not 10, then I'm obligated to eat the nevela in treif, and there's no Kiddush Hashem. Because the pasuk says, "V'nikdashti b'tov b'nei Yisrael." Now we have Yalfusas, and these Yalfusas tell us that Yehorig Val Yavar applies not only v'nikdashti b'tov b'nei Yisrael in public, but Rabbim, but in Gimel Averes Chamuros, like for example, Avodah Zarah, it says b'chol nafshecha, and in Ritzicha, where we have my chazis, and we derive Gili Arayis from Ritzicha. In these Yalfusos, we have another category of Yehorig Val Yavar. You and I say, before the Baal HaMaor, that new category of Yehorig Val Yavar that's derived from three Alfusos is generated by the Chumras Avera, and there's no V'chai B'hem. That's what the Torah is telling me. B'chol nafshcha, and there's no V'chai B'hem. No, says the Baal HaMaor, this is an extension of Kiddush Hashem. Not a new halacha based on Chumras Avera, but it's an extension of the pasuk V'nikdashti. And the new Yalfus is going to tell me that in these particular Averos, Kiddush Hashem and Yehorig Val Yavar will apply even B'tzina. As we said before, because of your statement that you will desecrate the most severe part of the Torah, when they're interested in having you violate and desecrate your Torah in order to save your life. And that halacha, as we discussed earlier, applies even B'tzina. And Rabbosai, I think what I'm applying here is that, I always like to talk to you about derech halimud. I'm mishugal davar echad. I'm obsessed with this concept of the brisker derech halimud. So you'll accept my apologies, but I'm not going to apologize. And one of the most important things in brisk is when you have 2 Yalfusos. You have a basic Yalfusa, and then you have a second Yalfusa. You always have to raise the question whether the second Yalfusa is simply a subcategory. It's an extension or an application of the original halacha, or it generates a whole new chiyuv unto itself. For example, again, this is in a different shir that I'm giving, a series on Hilchas Talmud Torah and the Ram, which I'd love to give to you, gentlemen, at some point. But anyway, the father's chiyuv vis-a-vis the Talmud Torah of his son comes under two different categories. One is bechina, meaning he has to teach his son Torah. And then there's another halacha that he has to pay a malamed out of pocket, hire a tutor, pay tuition. One of the guys in my class told me he went to Frisch High School in New Jersey, and I couldn't believe what they charge there per year. Okay, it's unbelievable how high tuition goes. And the question is the chiyuv to pay a malamed a brand new chiyuv, or is an extension of the chiyuv of bechina? And again, there are tremendous nafkaminas, which I'm not going to go into now. Here also, I'm going to ask you the following question. When the Torah says Yehoreg Val Yavar and the Gimel Averes Chamuros, is that under the influence, the umbrella, and the shadow of an Ikdashti B'toch B'nei Yisrael Lo Sechalu Hashem? Or it's a brand new chiyuv? And if not for the HaMaor, we would certainly assume the latter, it's a brand new chiyuv. Has nothing to do with Kiddush Hashem. And each Yalfus is telling me how chomer this Avera is, and it's above V'chai. But the HaMaor rejects it, because the HaMaor holds that V'chai applies even to these Gimel Averes Chamuros. So why do I have to give up my life? Why not apply V'chai? And on that, the HaMaor understands that these Yalfusas are extending the original mitzvah of an Ikdashti. But because of the Chumas Avera, and because of Lavuri al Das Komachavin, that combination is, shall we say, very powerful, and it creates a new category of Kiddush Hashem. Because of A plus B, Chumas Avera plus Lavuri al Das Komachavin, the nature of the Maisa is transformed into a desecration of God's holy name. And therefore, Yehoreg Val Yavar. But it's all part of the general, how do you say, Bechasut? You familiar with that phrase the Israelis use? Bechasut Kiddush Hashem. Not a separate new entity of Chumas Avera and the suspension of V'chai, but rather an extension of Kiddush Hashem that will apply even b'tzid.
So, sorry, just as a technical or structural way of learning, isn't it weird for the Alfusas to come right at the end? We've introduced these three.
The Alfusas come what?
The Alfusa of Lavore al Das or whatever comes right at the end. I mean, we've introduced this thing. We've been having this idea the whole time that these three, they trump V'chai, and then comes Rav at the end and says, what, whatever, it's only Lavore Das and not Lanos Atzma. In other words, all this time.
According to Baal. Right.
According to HaMaor, yes. It's a strange way of learning because it's like, it's backtracking right at the end.
So again, what you're doing is you're granting the HaMaor, but you're asking a question on Rav, which is fine.
Could be.
You know, you're jacking it up back to Rav.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
And you're asking, and it's funny because, you know, at first glance, Rav seems to be deriving it from Esther. You follow me? That's an interesting kind of Yalfusa. You know, because Esther was married to Mordechai, and because there's Gila Rice even with a guy, how could Esther have possibly submitted herself to living with Achashverosh? The answer must be that Lanos Atzmo Komachavin is mater, even the Gimel Averes Chamuros. That's what it seems to be at superficial level.
Right.
But that's very difficult to say that because we have no other way of understanding Esther, we're going to derive the most radical conclusion, namely that Lanos Atzmo Komachavin is mater Gili Arayos. Mind-boggling. And then we're going to extend that to Avodah Zarah and to Shvichas Damim. I mean, with all due respect to Esther, I'm a big Esther fan. But it's got to be more than that. But again, there are two ways of understanding the alfusos of the Gimel Averis Chamuros. You have to admit that. You could understand it as creating a separate new Machayev, if you want to use that term, of Yeharg Val Yavo, and that's called Chumas Avera, that suspends the Chayim. Or you could learn it. It's not just coincidental, it's Yeharg Val Yavo. I mean, we've heard the term Yeharg Val Yavo before. Where did the Torah say be Moser Nefesh? In Kiddush Hashem. And that's the case of Farhesia, of Barabin, even with Shar Avera. Now again, all of a sudden I'm listening and I'm hearing the same three words of Yeharg Val Yavor in the case of the three Averos. I'm hearing that the Torah is requiring me to give up my life. Doesn't that sound awfully familiar to you? Where did you encounter Yeharg Val Yavor Mesiras Nefesh? In Kiddush Hashem. Okay, it was for us. But we have limudim that maybe this Kiddush Hashem and Chil Hashem, even if it's not the Farhesia, drop the requirement of Farhesia. But the Baal HaMaor sees a very complex integration of A plus B of Avera Chamura plus Kiddush Hashem. And with that very explosive combination, we say to you, what are you doing here? You are making a statement that your life is greater than Chil Hashem. You're being Machal Hashem with the worst Averos. And it's Lavuri al Das. This guy has nothing in mind other than to get you to violate your Torah. I passed here on the boardwalk the other hour, maybe 2-3 hours ago. It's a beautiful day here. And I overheard there was like a booth on the boardwalk of a couple of Israelis that were breaking their teeth in English. And they were stopping people to talk to them about the 10 Commandments. And when I took a second look, I realized these were missionaries. And you know what? I was tempted to want to just blow the place up. I was such a kadoy. So this guy wants you to violate Avodah Zarah for the sake of Lavuri al Das? Fair on you. That's Kiddush Hashem. That's Chil Hashem. That's the Baal HaMaor. But now we get to the most complicated part of the Baal HaMaor, and that's the Ramban's objection. Ramban has a sugya in Masechet Pesachim Daf Chaf Heyam in Beis. You'll see this all in the Milchamas Hashem. I think it's on page Yud Ches in the Dape Harif. Am I right about that? If you could just double check me on that. So maybe we'll read some of it inside. And the Gemara says, Bakol misrapim chutz me'avodah zarah. Gili arayos and shvichas dam. The man is a chole sheyesh bo sakon. His life is on the line. He could save his life, that's misrapim, with one of the three averas chamuros. And it's unbelievable. The Gemara is going to apply it not just to avodah zarah with some sort of voodoo concoction, but even to Gili Arayos. You could have Gili Arayos to save a person's life. Yeah, you have to be a psychiatrist for that. But that's what the Gemara assumes. Frek the Ramban. Where's Lavuri al Das? Where's Chil Hashem? All we have is Pikuach Nefesh versus Avera Chamura. And the Gemara establishes he has to die. We had a whole sugya, if you remember last week. Let's say he didn't die and he violated the Gimel Averas Chamuros. Is he punishable? Is he culpable in a Jewish court? Fine. had the Rambam, and we had the Rambam. I'm not going into that again. How could the Baal HaMaor, asks the Ramban, apply the principle of lanos atzmo kamachavin and advocate in favor of v'chai bohem and pikuach nefesh for the Gimel Averis Chamuros, when the Gemara says that bakol misrapim chutz? Misrapim is certainly lanos atzmo kamachavin. And there's no other way of interpreting the Gemara in Pesachim, says Ramban, unless you assume that machmas chumras havera, there is no v'chai bohem. Meaning that v'chai bohem is suspended in the cases of Gimel Averis Chamuros. So how could the Baal HaMaor use hanos atzmo kamachavin as a mitigating factor? And sometimes you hear a kasha, and it just torpedoes the whole structure. The whole Baal HaMaor goes down the tubes. And we work so hard to make some sense out of the Baal HaMaor, and now the Ramban just blows it out of the water. Because the Baal HaMaor applies v'chai bohem in the Gimel Averis Chamuros. And he's going to allow you to violate the Gimel Averis Chamuros for the sake of v'chai bohem mitzla nos atzmo kamachavin. How could you do that when the Gemara says bakol misra? Now, Rabosai, let's backtrack for a moment and then come back. We had the Rambam in Perikei Milchus Yisodei HaTorah Halacha Daled and in Halacha Vav. The Rambam wants to know in both cases, Halacha Daled and Halacha Vav, when there's a Harg Val Yavam, and instead of giving up your life, you violate the law, the transgression, are you punishable? And if you recall, the Rambam says A and not A. Seems to contradict himself. In Halacha Daled, in the case of someone who puts a gun to your head, and at the pain of death, violate one of the three Averos, the Rambam says, Ein bezdin manishinos. But in Halacha Vav, when he comes to Misrapim, the Rambam says that if he went ahead and in order to save his life, he violated one of the three Averos, is manishinos so ba'onish haroil. We're going to punish him. Is anybody here who remembers how we tried to justify and reconcile these two Rambams? Anybody? I don't bite. So if you don't have to be, I won't be very harsh. It's like somebody couldn't read the Gemara well when the Rav Shir, so he called him a Turk. He said to him in Yiddish, "Du leinst wie a Turk." And I guess there's a phrase that you read like a Turk. So the guy answered, Rebbe, ich bin a Turk. I'm a Turkish Jew. My parents are from Turkey. The Rav just fell on that one guy who's a Turk. But anyway, I'm not going to call you a Turk, but who can help me out here? How did we reconcile these two Rambams? Very quickly, because the time is going to go by. No, in Zoom, I never know when it's silence fell upon the crowd. I don't know what that means. Maybe you.
It means we don't remember.
I remember discussing it, but there's something to do with Shev Al Taseh, maybe.
No.
Something to do with Oines.
Excellent. Now you're hot. It has to do with onus. Onus exempts you from punishment. But there are two categories of onus. There's external onus
right.
and internal onus. External ones is the case in Halacha Dalid where he puts a gun to your head and he's trying to force you to violate the three Averos Chamuros. The Rambam says that under the pain of death and the fear of the ma'anes, maybe you can't think clearly, you violate Avodah Zarah, whatever it might be, we're not going to punish you. That's called onus. Onus will alleviate punishment. I'm talking about punishment in the courts. But in the case of Misrapim, there's no external onus. Again, you may be in a state of fear of death, but you can't attribute that to any external force. That's something that you have to fight with and battle with internally. And the Avera says there's no v'chai b'hem. So if we neutralize onus in the case of an internal onus, we're left with the Chumas Avera, and mirtzoncha, you made that decision, you'll be punished. I want to use that distinction here to perhaps make sense out of the Baal HaMaor. Let's see if we can pull this off. The Ramban's kasha is from the sugya of Hakol Misrapim. In that sugya, there's no Kiddush Hashem. It's purely lanos atzmo komacham. We're not trying to violate the Torah. We're trying to save a life. And yet there's no pikuach nefesh. So I want to suggest the following. The Baal HaMaor introduces here Kiddush Hashem. And it's a question of whether or not you're going to make a statement that your life is greater and worth more than the most severe Averos Chamuros. And in the case of Misrapim, you are making a statement that to save your life, you will violate the Averos Chamuros. That introduces Chil Hashem. Masha Ein Kain in the Baal HaMaor's case, where there's an external ma'anes who's forcing you, then he can change, as strange as this sounds, and it's pretty revolutionary, but he can effectuate a change in the nature of the action, in the nature of the Avera. He could remove from the Avera the element of Chil Hashem and replace it with Hanos Atzmo Komachavim. The entire Maisa now of violating the Torah, even in the Averos Chamuros, changes its complexion. Why? Because who's the Balabas? Who's riding the horse? Who has the right and the ability to determine the nature of the Maisa? Is this Maisa a Maisa of Chil Hashem? Are you desecrating the God's Torah and undermining his religion? And the answer is, it depends on the Ma'anis. The Ma'anis, the external Ma'anis, is capable, according to Jewish law, of determining the nature of this action. I would say, who kovea tiv hamaseh. And he can be kovea that this has nothing to do with religion. This is purely motivated by Hana. But in a case of an internal onus, like the case of Misrapim, there's no one to blame but yourself. There's no one else who could determine the statement and the declaration that's implicit in your taking Avodah Zarah to save your life other than you. And basically, we have no mafkia, we have no way of changing the nature of the Maisa because you are making a declaration that the Avera is less important than your life is more important than the Avera. That, according to Baal HaMaor, becomes Chil Hashem. So even though the Ramban understood that in Hakol Misrapim Chutz, we see that there's no Pikuach Nefesh in Gimel Averos, the Baal HaMaor is not going to take it that way. Because the Baal HaMaor is committed to the position that there is V'chai Bohem, and there is Pikuach Nefesh, even in the Gimel Averos Chamuros. All 613, according to the Baal HaMaor, are included under V'chai Bohem. But there's a limit to V'chai Bohem. If the V'chaibahem makes a statement, then that declaration that's implicit in V'chaibahem, when you save your life at the expense of X, Y, and Z, that becomes Chil Hashem. And now the question is, under what circumstances does Hatzalah in the Gimel Averis Chamuris become Chil Hashem? And here the Baal HaMaor will accept the following distinction. If there's an external ma'anes, then we can play with it. We can toy with it. We can question whether or not the Maisa Vera is inherently and essentially Chil Hashem. And that will be determined paradoxically by the machshava and the motivation of the ma'anes. But not in the case of Misrapim. In the case of Misrapim, we don't have an external ma'anes. There's no one who on the outside of this Avera can stand there and say, well, this is not a declaration. This is a declaration. You have decided on your own that your life takes precedence. You are pressing the Pikuach Nefesh button against the Gimel Averis Chamuros. And that's Chil Hashem. No, you'll ask me, but even in the case of an external ma'anes, you have chosen to submit yourself to that Avera, and it's Avera Chamura in order to save your life. But the answer is no. We can change the nature of that Maisa. We could redefine and recategorize the complexion of the Maisa and be mafkia and take it out of the realm, rip it out of the realm, uproot it from Chil Hashem through the power of Hanos Atzmo Komach. That's only if we can add the principle of ma'anis, of the external ma'anis.
So you put it another way, when the person does the Hanas Atzma, it's more unambiguous. In other words, the Hanas Atzma has to be completely unambiguous. If you are doing it for yourself, there's always a suffix there. So if there's a suffix of Hanas Atzma or not, then you have to give up your life. If there's no suffix whatsoever, he can mafkia the suffix, the ma'anes. I don't know if that's...
If you're happy with that formulation, go with it. But I'm personally, on my very limited understanding, I hesitate. I shy away from introducing suffix over here. I don't want to introduce suffix.
Okay.
I want to know whether or not we have a clear-cut Chil Hashem. What are the guidelines of Chil Hashem? Again, we're talking Betzina. We're talking about the revolution of the Baal HaMaor, that the Gimel Averis Chamuris are an extension of Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem, not a new entity. We're going to operate within the framework of Pikuach Nefesh and V'chaibahem. But the Baal HaMaor wants to set up the guidelines. At what point does the Avera Chamura integrate with a decision that implies and entails a desecration of Hashem's name? At what point does the Gimel Averis Chamuris, despite the V'chaibahem, become a desecration of God's name, a Chil Hashem? And that's what the Baal HaMaor is working out here within the framework of our Sugin Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Dal. And he comes to the following two conclusions. He says, number one, in the Averis Chamuros, if there's a clear-cut statement of Chil Hashem, meaning a clear-cut statement here of violating, of doing something that's a desecration, that's a violation of God's Torah for the sake of saving my life, if that's the nature of the Maisa, then there's Chil Hashem, then there's Kiddush Hashem. If you could, on the other hand, take away the nature of the Maisa, and the person who's forcing you into the Maisa has the ability to take away from that Maisa, Hashverosh is not interested in any violation of the Torah, in any Chil Hashem. The entire Maisa now, in which the Ma'anis forces her and compels her, is all within the framework of Lanos Atzmo Kamacham. Not me didn't suffer. I'm not going with the suffer. I'm going with the Vada. But here's where the Baal HaMaor puts the stop, the limitation. This is not Chil Hashem, because the Ma'anes is motivated and only interested in Lanos Atzmo Kamacham. That strips the Maisa of the element of Chil Hashem. But that's because there's a Ma'anes. If there's no Ma'anes, then it goes back to square one. And square one is that you're making a statement that you're willing to violate the Averis Chaburis for the sake of Hatzolah in order to save your life. You're putting your life on a higher level than the Averis Chaburis. That's Chil Hashem. And as we said before, that applies even B'tzid.
No, but what I'm saying, whatever, you might not know my formulation, but what I'm saying is that the Ma'anes makes the Hanos Atzmai has to be a Vada Hanos Atzmai. In the case of misrapping, it could be Hanos Atzmai, but you don't know. The only way of determining for sure is if there's something else.
I'm not sure what you mean by you don't know. Okay, look. Again,
Well, you don't know because you just see someone saving himself.
If
you
you're
see someone saving himself.
If it helps you,
okay, whatever.
I don't think that Lanos Atzmo Kavin is a suffix. And I don't think in the case of Misrapa we have any doubts about what motivates him. He wants to save his life. He wants to implement and activate Pikuach Nefesh, but he's violating the Averis Chaburas. That's still Hashem according to the Baal.
But anyone else who hears about it, because it says Pesina, won't know. The only way of knowing for sure is if we don't know.
All right, we don't need to know.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Okay, I see that our time is gone, and I appreciate, especially, I haven't seen Yechiel lately, so it's good to see you, Yechiel. And